I'd like to tell you a little bit about the organizations that have come together to make this evening happen. Environment Haliburton is an organization based in Haliburton that has been in existence for 17 years. Two of its founding members, Carolyn Coburn and Eric Lilius, are still hard at work with us tonight. Environment Haliburton has kept environmental matters in focus in our community and have advocated, lobbied, educated, and acted as consultants on many environmental matters, including climate action over the years. Climate Action Muskoka, represented here tonight by one of its co-founders, Sue McKenzie, is an inclusive, nonpartisan group acting to become the big voice with the bold ideas to drive climate solutions in the District of Muskoka. In December 2020, thanks to their efforts, a climate emergency was declared unanimously by the District of Muskoka to achieve a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, reaching zero by 2050. They are now working with the 5 lower tier governments to implement the same emissions goals. Seniors for Climate Action Now is a recently formed climate action group based in Ontario, whose mandate is to inform and mobilize seniors in an effort to prevent more climate catastrophes. Young people are calling on governments to act decisively on the climate emergency. SCAN, not scam, will support their lead, amplify their voices, and add their own to the growing movement for climate action and climate justice. It is now my privilege to introduce our presenters, Terry Moore and David Robertson, who are both members of the Education Committee of SCAN. Terry, who is Vice President of Environment Haliburton, is a retired union negotiator with a previous life as an environmental and natural resources researcher at the Ontario Legislative Assembly and the Ontario Public Interest Research Group. He was actively involved with the Coalition of Haliburton Property Owners Association's Love Your Lake project and a board member with the Halls and Hawk Lakes Property Owners Association. Terry is also the host of Planet Haliburton, an environmental justice radio program on Canoe FM here in Haliburton, and the president of the Haliburton Highlands Green Burial Society. David is a retired Director of Work Organization and Training at the Canadian Auto Workers for over 25 years. Prior to that, he was a researcher with the Ontario NDP at Queen's Park, and before that was involved in setting up the university-based Ontario Public Interest Research Group. David is a member of Seniors for Climate Action Now and current chairperson of the Education Committee. Before getting involved in SCAN, David was active in the Good Jobs for All Coalition's successful campaign to stop Google's takeover of the Toronto waterfront. Carolyn Coburn from Environment Haliburton will be moderating questions from the chat box, which you can type in as you think of them. If you could state in your question whether the question you're asking should be directed to Terry or David or both, that would be helpful. Eric Lilius is also of Environment Haliburton and is looking after the Zoom controls and has you all muted. I think we're all introduced, and I am now going to hand the meeting over to Terry to begin the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and to the 3 sponsoring organizations. And thanks to all of you for showing up on a Friday night. Terry and I are quite honored to be at an event that marks Fridays for the Future. Even during the pandemic, the global youth movement has continued to fight for climate action, and in doing so, it continues to inspire us. On December 11th, 2020, the federal government released its climate action plan. It's called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. And it is a report that sets in motion the programs, the initiatives, the fundings that the federal government has committed to get us to Paris 2030, to reduce Canada's large greenhouse gas emissions. If we are ever to achieve 2030, the Paris agreements, it is the proposals in this plan that are supposed to get us there. The Education Committee of SCAN, Seniors for Climate Action Now, when the plan first came out, started thinking about, well, maybe we better understand it. If this is the plan that is supposed to get us to Paris 2030 and net zero by 2050, then maybe we should try to get a handle on it. What is the climate plan? Is it likely to succeed? So those were the two questions that motivated our review. And in our review, we did basically three things. We reviewed the climate plan itself. And after doing that, we had to review the modeling appendices and various other appendices that were associated with the plan. And then we finally had to review a whole series of related policy initiatives, because we concluded that the climate plan is really at the center of a constellation of policy initiatives. Soon after it was released, the government launched the hydrogen strategy for Canada. Soon after it was released, the government announced the nuclear action plan for Canada. And then just last week, the government announced a new carbon credit offset market that is also part of the plan. So at one level, the climate plan is a smorgasbord of climate initiatives, a pretty impressive checklist, as you can see from this slide. So at first blush, that's quite promising. There are programs to help homeowners and car drivers shift away from fossil fuels. There's an escalating price on carbon. There's a commitment to protect and restore natural ecosystems. There are promises of more support for Indigenous climate issues. But the plan is more than a series of initiatives. The plan actually puts in place the building blocks that inform the government's approach to climate action. And that approach is worrying. I'm going to build this pyramid from the bottom left. The first thing to realize about the plan is the government is dealing with climate change. It is not dealing with a climate emergency. Nowhere in the plan is there mention of a climate crisis. Nowhere in the plan is there the need to tackle a climate emergency. Secondly, moving to the right on that bottom layer, the plan commits to the same old model of economic growth, albeit this time in a greenwash. And economic growth is the goal of the plan. Third, there is an unwavering belief that market players responding to price signals are going to solve the climate problem. And moving to the second tier, there's also an unwavering belief that technological innovations are going to solve the problem. And throughout the entire report, there is a foreboding sense that through it all, the oil and gas industry has to be protected. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, Canada, according to the plan, is going to emerge in this era as a vibrant, low carbon export economy. A number of years ago, Stephen Harper boasted that Canada was an energy superpower. Now, Trudeau is making a similar bid, but this time it's as a hydrogen superpower. So tonight's discussion is going to kind of be grouped, revolved around four conclusions. After our review, we have no confidence in the climate plan. It won't deliver our Paris targets. The plan contains a fatally flawed carbon pricing system. The plan suffers from glaring and at times alarming omissions. And the plan commits to developing and selling fossil fuel hydrogen in the name of climate action. And in the process, it transfers billions of public money to the private sector.
So the government's province is pretty clear in the climate plan. This is what they say. The proposed actions outlined in this plan will enable Canada to exceed its current 2030 target. Recall the Paris target is to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to 2005. It's also important to realize that these targets represent much less of an ambitious goal than that which would be required to take us to 1.5 degrees Celsius. One way to assess the climate plan is to look at some specific climate initiatives. Our review suggests that individually and taken together, they are too little, too late. Not enough soon enough, not enough money, poorly conceived, designed, and implemented. It's not ambitious enough. There's no direct link between the program and expected emission reductions. And a few quick examples will illustrate our concern. As an example of not enough soon enough, take the home retrofit program as an example. When it ends in 2028, this program will have provided a very modest level of assistance to retrofitting only 1 in 10 homes. What we need instead of this is a deep and extensive retrofit program. With respect to poor design and implementation, take a look at the 2 billion tree program that was announced in the last election and repeated in the climate plan, and not one of those trees has yet been planted. The program completely ignores the fact that for the last 15 years, Canada's forests have not been carbon sinks. They are net carbon sources, and the government knows this. Planting another 200 million trees a year won't change that reality. Not ambitious enough. A number of years ago, the government announced the aspirational goal of eliminating internal combustion cars by 2040. This was a soft target. Many countries and regions have proposed hard targets with deadlines to ban internal combustion engines. The climate plan maintains the zero emissions vehicle subsidy and provides money for electric buses, but it doesn't turn soft targets into hard rules. In fact, it doesn't mention targets at all. One of the key reasons why we don't think the climate plan can achieve Canada's Paris targets is that there are no links between the 64 specific projects that are listed in the plan and expected emission outcomes. The key lesson, surely, from past failures to achieve our targets is that if you don't build in systems to measure and track program outcomes, you can't possibly manage them effectively.
Earlier, we said that to reach Paris, we must reduce emissions by 30% from the base year of 2005. Here's what we know about the size of that reduction. In 2005, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions were 730 megatons. By 2030, they have to be reduced to 511. The difference is 219. And 219 is a huge number. The reduction that's involved in that is mind-boggling at one level. In fact, it is more than all of the oil and gas emissions in the year 2005. Or another way to express it, it is bigger than all of the heavy industry combined with all of the emissions from buildings in 2005. The volume of reduction is a huge, huge undertaking. But in addition to the volume of change, there is also the rate of change. When you compare the required future cuts against our past records, here's what you see. In the 18 years between 2005 and 2018, Canada reduced emissions by a total of only 14 megatons. In the 12 years between 2018 and 2030, we need to reduce them by over 200. We have to go from an annual reduction of 0.77 megatons a year to an average reduction of 17 megatons a year. That's an increase of over 2,100%. The numbers in this chart are taken from the modeling appendix of the climate plan. In the left column are broadly defined sectors such as oil and gas, transportation, heavy industry, building. On the right-hand side of the column are the differences between 2005 and 2030 in terms of our greenhouse gases. We'll just look at a couple of these numbers. The two largest categories of change are in electricity and in that category that's called LULUCF, which basically stands for land use and forestry. These two categories alone, if you add them up, account for more than half of all of the emission reductions we're going to achieve by 2030. The largest category is electricity, 108. That alone is almost half of all of the reductions. And that alone is due to a policy initiative that says, let's phase out coal-fired electricity plants. What an argument for phasing out fossil fuel when you see how significant that is. It speaks to the importance of phasing out fossil fuel. The second category we saw on that list is LULUCF. Sorry, it's a hard abbreviation. It kind of sounds like elusive. It stands for land use change, and forestry. You see, according to this chart, it is responsible for the second largest reductions in emissions by 2030. 27 megatons. The government refers to these numbers as an accounting contribution. In fact, there isn't a sector called LUCF. There's no such thing as LUCF as a sector. It didn't exist in 2005. So it is now an accounting convention that the government uses. So all of the other numbers from oil and gas, from transportation, from buildings are all forecasts. The elusive numbers are basically made up. The land use and forestry sector contribution in large part is based on what they argue they have from forests sequestering carbon. The logic is forests sequester carbon so we can use that to offset carbon emissions elsewhere in the economy. But we saw earlier that our managed forests are actually carbon sources, not carbon sinks. What the Liberal climate plan does is it discounts greenhouse gases from forestry, it turns them into offsets, and then it uses those numbers to reach our Paris targets. This next slide, God, what are they doing? Friday night and you're putting up this kind of slide? Sorry, but just let me work through it a little bit. The slide is bad, the arithmetic is hopefully good. In 2005, emissions from all real sectors was 730. We have to get to 511, but when you add up all of the reductions on the chart that we just saw, you get to 531. In other words, we're 20 megatons higher than the Paris targets. However, when you add in the elusive contribution, which is 27 megatons, all of the math changes. Instead of having emissions from all sectors at 531 megatons, we now have emissions at 504 megatons. That is 7 megatons better than the Paris targets. And that allows the government to say, we are going to exceed our Paris targets. With an accounting contribution, we don't get to Paris. In fact, Canada has failed to meet the last 9 emission reduction targets. We're on our way to number 10. And number 10 is the most important one we face.
So one of the reasons we are unlikely to reach the Paris targets is the inadequacy of specific climate action programs. But the major reason is because the government prefers a passive and indirect approach that relies on market signals, incentives, and a whole lot of flexibility when it comes to major greenhouse gas emitters. So we talked a little bit about, and we mentioned in the introduction, the Canada's flawed carbon pricing system. Well, the pricing system is really got two parts to it. There's a charge on fossil fuel, the fuel charge, and there's a cap and trade system for large industry. The carbon price will increase from $15 a ton per year in 2022 until 2030, when it'll reach $170 a ton, which is about 40 cents a liter at the gas pump. People are generally familiar with the fuel charge part of the system, but I think less familiar with the second part. So this part is related to big emitters. Canada has 1,700 emitters who are responsible for about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions. 17 large emitters cause about 78 million tons of emissions. That's an amount greater than all of the emissions from Canada's agricultural sector, or about 90% of the emissions from all buildings in the country. To deal with emissions from big emitters, the government has designed something called the output-based pricing system. Now, instead of hard caps and tightening emission standards, the output-based pricing system sets a price on emissions above a specified level. But then it provides a number of ways for companies to avoid reducing emissions and avoid paying the costs at the same time. There are a number of problems with the output-based pricing system. Companies are free to pollute up to a certain specified level. Compare that to the principle that's built into the fuel charge, where every liter of gas you use is subjected to the carbon surcharge. But above the level set in the OBPS, polluters, these big emitters, can continue to emit greenhouse gases so long as they reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of production. The government makes a distinction between absolute levels of greenhouse gases and levels that are based on the carbon intensity of production. This is called the intensity rule. An example is probably a useful way to explain the difference. Cenovus is a large oil and natural gas company with its headquarters in Calgary. Here's a recent quote from the company. Cenovus is targeting to reduce per barrel greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the end of 2030 using a 2019 baseline and hold its absolute emissions flat by the end of 2030. The new 2030 greenhouse gas emissions targets are among the most ambitious in the world for an upstream exploration and production company. It's not going to reduce its absolute emissions by 2030. It will, however, reduce its per barrel emissions. The atmosphere cares about absolute emissions, not emission intensity. The worst thing about this quote is the boast at the end and the potential for it actually being true. The new 2030 greenhouse gas emission targets are among the most ambitious in the world for an upstream exploration and production company. So let's go back to the problems. If companies reduce the intensity of carbon in a unit of production, under this system, they get credits which allow them to pollute more later or sell those credits to other companies who can use them as they continue to pollute. This is how the government describes their system. The amount each facility pays depends on how much carbon pollution it emits to make 1 unit of product. If a facility finds a way to pollute less per unit, it will save money or earn credits. In addition to all of the above, the government has announced a new offset market, which will allow large emitters to pollute more by investing in carbon offsets elsewhere, for example, forest regeneration projects. If there's any money raised by the output-based pricing system, it will be returned to the industry through a variety of programs. In addition, in the climate plan, it's announced that there's a massive amount of money that will be given to the industry regardless of emission revenues, about $5 billion. By comparison, that $5 billion is about twice as much as allotted under the climate plan for the entire home energy retrofit program. In the end, we think that the output-based pricing system is an expensive, overly complicated system that will encourage companies to find ways to avoid paying their emission liabilities rather than reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's too much room to game the system. And the system the government has designed will force others to pick up the emission shortfalls and pay the bill.
Most governments, many international agencies, long lists of climate experts all point to the need for dramatic increases in renewable energy. Report after report point to the critical importance of solar and wind. In fact, it's hard to imagine any climate action plan that doesn't make a strong commitment to renewable energy, that doesn't make a strong commitment to solar and to wind. But that is precisely the case with the Liberal climate plan. There's two things we know about renewables in Canada. First, they don't count for much. And second, after some initial growth, they are now faltering. This slide shows the composition of renewable energy portion of Canada's energy supply. As a reference point, renewable energy is only about 17% of our total energy supply. But of that, hydroelectricity accounts for 67.5%, solid biomass at 23.3%, wind at 5.2%, ethanol 1.8%, municipal waste and landfill gas 0.8%, photovoltaic solar power 0.1%. In fact, we get more energy from landfill gas than photovoltaic solar. Solar and wind have become less expensive and more efficient year after year. They are now one of the least expensive energy sources, much less than nuclear, much less than hydrogen. But despite this competitive advantage in terms of price, the annual additions to renewable energy have fallen considerably. So even though the costs are down, investment has tanked. The government's climate plan doesn't even address these issues. There is no section in the report devoted to developments in wind and solar power capacity. There is no commentary about the role wind and solar can play in the shift to electrification. There are no new funding programs to support such a transition. There are no targets for the expansion of clean, renewable energy supply. Renewable solar power and wind energy stand as one of the most glaring emissions in the Healthy Environment and the Healthy Economy report. Instead of renewables, the federal government has bought the hydrogen hype, the nuclear promise, and the techno fix of carbon storage.
Another key emission from the plan has to do with accountability for achieving targets. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change points to the need for carbon budgets as a necessary link between temperature outcomes and greenhouse gas emissions. A global carbon budget is the accumulative amount of carbon pollution that can be dumped into the atmosphere without pushing global average temperatures past the tipping point. National carbon budgets focus on countries taking their fair share of global greenhouse gas emission reductions that are required to keep temperature increases below that number. Carbon budgets are the best way to make governments accountable, but the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act tabled by the federal government last fall ignores them. The climate plan omits any mention of carbon budgets. A carbon budget for Canada, based on doing our fair share to keep global temperature increases below 1.5 degrees C, would require keeping most of the country's oil and gas in the ground. Let's summarize what we discussed so far. The specific programs and initiatives in the climate plan, such as home retrofits, tree planting, and zero emission vehicles, won't get us to Paris. The carbon pricing system, and especially the output-based pricing portion of that system, is seriously flawed and won't get us to Paris. The climate plan suffers from glaring omissions, and those omissions will make it very difficult for the country to reach its Paris targets. The federal government claims that the climate plan that achieves both environmental goals and our economic hopes, but the economic considerations trump the climate crisis. We don't want to underestimate the need for an economic and social transformation. The climate emergency demands it. The issue is, what is the economic model under which such a transition will occur?
So it's taken a little bit of time to get here, but this is now at the heart of what the Liberal government climate action plan is really all about. It can best be described as both a climate and as an economic formula. It reads like this: carbon pricing plus hydrogen plus carbon storage plus nuclear equals Paris 2030 and beyond. Behind this equation is arrayed a pretty powerful set of forces. There's big oil and gas, there's the hydrogen lobby, the nuclear industry, the carbon storage companies, the big emitters. So we've already talked a little bit about the carbon pricing part of that equation. In the time we've got left, we want to talk a bit about hydrogen and carbon storage. And it's clear we're not going to have any time to talk about nuclear in the time we have today. But let's think about the hydrogen piece of this. A few days after the release of the climate plan, the government launched what they call the hydrogen strategy for Canada. They need to be read in tandem. Interestingly enough, the hydrogen strategy is about twice as long as the actual climate plan, in part because it is the climate plan. It's hard to overstate the role of hydrogen in the government's climate plan. Here, in their own words, this quote comes from The Healthy Environment and the Healthy Economy. Hydrogen is one of Canada's most exciting economic transformation opportunities. It will enable a new Canadian competitive advantage in a low carbon economy. It will position Canada to become a world-leading supplier of hydrogen and hydrogen technologies. It will generate economic opportunities through exports and direct foreign investment. This is the climate and economic plan. These quotes reinforce the point, but actually come from the hydrogen strategy document, because the hydrogen strategy is, they say, an ambitious framework that seeks to position Canada as a global hydrogen leader. The strategy will utilize Canadian expertise to build new hydrogen supply that will power our country's clean energy future. In a remarkably short time, the hydrogen lobby has achieved the political, financial, and regulatory support to launch a multi-decade hydrogen program. According to the strategy, hydrogen will play an integral role in Canada's future energy mix. It claims that by 2050, up to 30% of Canada's end-use energy will be hydrogen. Recall earlier that we said renewable energy was 17% of our total supply. By 2050, 30% will be hydrogen. We finally found an ambitious climate action target in the program, and it's hydrogen. It's quite amazing, actually, what hydrogen is going to do. Take a look at this slide. These all come from the reports. It's going to transform flagging sectors into thriving industries. It's going to drive innovation and investment all across the economy. It's going to create 350,000 jobs. It's going to generate economic opportunities everywhere, provide opportunities for Indigenous communities. It's going to harness the skill and the technical expertise of a generation. It's going to fuel economic growth. It's going to revitalize Canada as a major energy exporter. It's going to be the path to net zero by 2050. In short, the list is long and it's exhausting. Well, that's the hype. What's the reality? Hydrogen has really a benevolent, clean energy image, but there are different types of hydrogen. Hydrogen is actually color-coded. There is green hydrogen, there is gray hydrogen, and there's blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen, the colors actually have to do with how it's made. Green hydrogen is produced through electrolysis. It uses renewable energy to convert water into hydrogen. This is the hydrogen we want. Blue hydrogen uses natural gas to convert methane into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. At this stage, the hydrogen is dirty hydrogen. It's called gray hydrogen. Gray hydrogen uses natural gas as the feedstock to fuel a process called steam reforming. And that steam reforming breaks down methane into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. The gray hydrogen becomes blue hydrogen when the carbon released during the production process is captured and stored somewhere underground forever. Once that happens, blue hydrogen is gray hydrogen that has been greenwashed. Canada fully commits to a fossil fuel hydrogen future. This is a quote. Canadian resources of natural gas can sustain current production levels for up to 300 years. Hydrogen production from natural gas offers a unique opportunity to leverage Canada's vast gas reserves. Or this, as the strategy notes, natural gas will have declining demand if it isn't used to produce hydrogen. So the hydrogen strategy is throwing a lifeline to fossil fuel industry. If hydrogen comprises 30% of energy use by 2050, and if all that hydrogen is blue hydrogen, it's going to mean an incredible increase in natural gas demand. It's going to mean a sizable increase in natural gas production. It's also going to mean a major push to promote carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There are a number of problems with hydrogen. First off, hydrogen is not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. Hydrogen is made by using energy that often is better used directly. For instance, even take green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is the right kind, but often it's the wrong choice. Why would you take renewable energy, turn water into hydrogen, and then use it for something when you can use the renewable energy directly to use it? That's the trade-off that has to be made. Blue hydrogen, it's amazing that they managed to call it blue hydrogen. Blue is good, right? I mean, blue is the planet. But blue hydrogen sets up a very expensive and a very complicated system to make natural gas a low carbon energy source. To export fossil fuel hydrogen, which this has a lot to do with, means we have to store the carbon here. And carbon capture, utilization, and storage is really a technological gamble. And it's a technological gamble that's going to require massive amounts of public money. But even so, the government is well on side. The climate plan commits Canada to develop a comprehensive carbon capture, use, and storage strategy, and to make, quote, strategic investments in large-scale industrial projects. Regardless of the problems associated with carbon storage and utilization, that's the path we're on: hydrogen and carbon storage.
So with Canada's hydrogen strategy, we're moving very fast in the wrong direction. Just how fast is illustrated by a few headlines from the last week or so. The first one is from March the 8th, and it reads, Alberta is asking the federal government for $30 billion to explore carbon capture, utilize, and storage technologies. And the second is from a few days ago. Canada to sign an agreement with Germany on the joint push to develop a hydrogen market. We're heading into the conclusion now. We want to draw a few of these strands together. And we think that in the end, our climate choices are stark and getting starker and very clear. We started this presentation quoting Justin Trudeau's Fossil First declaration back in 2017. No country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and leave them there. That fossil first perspective leads directly to the Liberal climate formula. Carbon pricing plus hydrogen plus carbon storage plus nuclear equals Paris 2030 and beyond. We think that the Liberal fossil first climate plan will lead us to climate disaster. The 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was absolutely clear about what we need to do. We need to engage in a rapid and far-reaching transition in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure, including buildings and transportation, and industrial systems. These systems, these transitions that we'll have to go through are unprecedented in terms of scale. We need deep emission reductions in all sectors. Embracing this climate first call to action would mean adopting a climate first formula that reads something like this: fossil fuel phase out plus hard caps plus clean renewables plus electrification equals Paris 2030 and system change. The climate justice movement has been and will continue in all likelihood to opt for and mobilize around some form of a climate first plan. The question is, can we mobilize enough people to reject fossil first and help pull us back from the brink of climate chaos? The stakes could not possibly be higher. On February 26th, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, released the latest report on the national climate goals the countries of the world have committed to by the end of 2020, emphasizing that they are nowhere near close enough to achieving the 1.5 degree Paris target. He characterized this as a red alert for the planet. The young climate activists mobilizing with their allies all over the world today are right. It's time to tell the truth. It's time for emergency climate action. It's time to end the fossil first era and put climate and people first. So that's all for us. And I want to thank you. And we look forward to the comment and question period to follow. So thank you for listening.
I think it's my turn to speak. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carolyn Coburn, and I'm the one that's going to moderate the questions. You've heard about this process that we've adopted. So it's great. People have been asking questions in the chat function, and please do continue to do so. However, first of all, I want to let you know that we have invited 3 people in the audience to pose questions just to get us started. And each of these people belongs to one of the sponsoring organizations. Katie Peroshi is a secretary at Environment Haliburton, but when she's not working with Environment Haliburton, she's the project manager at Zygoptera Consulting. She holds a number of degrees from Trent, Fleming College, and Dalhousie University. Katie has worked for governmental organizations, including municipalities, the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and the Canadian Forest Service. She loves to grow vegetables, is a mother to one, and as I said, currently the Secretary for Environment, Haliburton. So Katie's going to ask the first question. After that, Claire Mian is a retired educator who is just returning to her, oh boy, I've got David Robertson sitting in front of my notes. He's just tried to get out of the way, and now it's Terry. Anyway, and she's recently joined the Stimulating and Forward-Thinking group in Seniors for Climate Action. Now she sits on the coordinating committee as well as on the education committee and platform committee. And then Sue McKenzie will wrap up the third question from the third sponsor. She's a retired elementary school teacher, long-term activist, climate activist, and the co-founder of Climate Action Muskoka. So now I will ask Katie to make the first question.
Right. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I think we can.
All right. Thanks, Terry and David, for a great presentation. You really did a good job summarizing and making clear of some very big documents. So I have a more, I'm a practical person, so I have kind of maybe a more practical question. So similar to many people, I'm a working parent, struggle every day to get things done and make ends meet. And also similar to many people, my husband and I, we try our best to reduce our carbon footprint by planning our car trips, growing our own food, etc. But beyond those daily things, we are struggling on how we can make a bigger impact and decrease global GHG emissions as individuals. The Liberal Party recommended 64 items, but to me, and kind of what you addressed, they feel disconnected from each other as well as from daily life. And the plan to me, like you described in your presentation, doesn't really feel like a very structured plan, but rather kind of 64 good sounding words. And that will not really make me as an individual make changes in my life. So similar to the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy document, it talks about incentives. Incentives, I think, are mentioned 20 times, and encouragement or encouraging actions is mentioned 9 times in the document, but there's no time right now for encouragement or incentives. As Greta says, our house is on fire. Or like what you said, Terry, it's too little, too late. So I basically have 2 kind of questions. So along with addressing the omissions, can you suggest how the government could have created a more structured, practical plan, either the plan itself or the associated policies, that would get the average person to quickly make changes in their daily life? So aside from addressing the large polluters, how can the plan be made for me and my neighbors? And with this, I wonder how the government can be more forceful, and how can they make system change and stop trying to please everyone today in order to protect us tomorrow? And how can they make this system change effectively? All right, there's my questions.
Is that all?
That's it for now.
Oh. You want to start with that, David?
Terry, I thought you promised me the questions were all going to be easy.
I did, but I lied.
You want to start?
I guess I could. I just want to say, Katie, that I think that there's lots that the government could have done if it was listening to different voices and representing different interests. And I think one of the things that it's become crystal clear to us is that the interests that they're representing are not the interests they're representing are the big moneyed interests in the country, the fossil fuel sector, and so on. And they want to extend the glide for the fossil fuel era, and everything else is built around that. And so what is missing, you're absolutely right, are programs into which individuals could fit but which they can't create themselves. I mean, the public transportation system that doesn't exist in Haliburton County can't be conjured up by us as individuals. It's got to be created by collective action. And there's just nothing in there at the scale of the kind of change that's required. Likewise with home retrofits. You know, we have a huge problem with our existing housing stock across the country and right here. But there's no way that people by themselves are going to have the money to make the kinds of investments as individuals in the fundamental changes that are necessary in order to basically to reduce the carbon footprint of our built infrastructure, as another example. The scale of the investment by the government is simply nowhere near the scale of the problem that we face. And there's nothing in there really for individuals to plug into so they can connect what they want to do with the capacity to do it. David.
So just quickly to add on that, I think that's so clear that I think that as individuals, the most that we can do right now is do what we're doing in terms of joining climate action groups, finding ways for climate action groups to join together to make our voices heard, to keep putting pressure on, to be saying to the Liberal government, this is wrong. This is the wrong direction. Just a brief example that the government committed to provide some funding for 5,000 electric buses. That's absolutely great, 5,000 electric buses. But that's by, that's over a course of a number of years. And the reality is we've got 30,000 school buses in Canada. We've got 15,000 buses in the public transit fleet. Why doesn't the government say by 2030 or very close to it, all of those buses are going to be electric? And if it's going to take us billions to do it, we'll do it. And that way people can take transit and they'll be taking transit that is electric and not diesel or fossil fuel based. So it's the same with zero emission vehicles. All the government committed to was to extend the current subsidy for 2 more years and put in some more electric chargers. Other countries are saying by certain dates, we are banning the internal combustion engine. Norway, way out ahead of everyone, 2020, 2025, no more internal combustion engines. Acts on the part of government is what we need now. We can live our lives as well as we can, reduce our carbon footprints as much as we possibly can, but we're at a point where we're 8.5 years away from 2030. We have to get the government to act.
Thank you.
The next question, I think that's for Claire.
Right. Great job, Terry and David. And there have been a few questions in the chat already asking where people can get copies. So let me just say that before getting to my question. David and Terry's slides and notes will be posted on the Seniors for Climate Action Now website, which just happened to go live today. So I'll put that website into the chat in a few minutes, as well as our email address. The full report, David and Terry are still in the middle of final edit, but certainly all 3 organizations will make that available as soon as we possibly can. My question is about the missing renewables. You mentioned that they only constitute about 17% of energy sources. And there are some people, there is controversy about the fact whether they will ever be able to constitute the majority or replace oil and gas. But still, the fact that they're almost totally missing from the HEHE report is pretty significant. So I'm just wondering, how do you account for that omission? What do you make of it?
Well, I make of it is I'm alarmed by it. I am absolutely flabbergasted. I read it, and when I kept reading, in fact, we couldn't believe it. So at one point we said, maybe we should just do a word search for solar in the report, because maybe we're just missing a section. And yeah, it came up. There was a few examples talked about here and there. But what's amazing is the government on its websites will say things like, solar power is the fastest growing energy source in Canada. And they don't say that it contributes absolutely a minuscule amount to our energy. I think it's a choice because there are two routes to the future. One is a fossil fuel route, and one is a solar and wind and a renewable route. And the federal government has chosen blue hydrogen. It has deliberately chosen a fossil fuel. We haven't talked about that small modular reactors. That's also part of the strategy, but it has made a deliberate choice. And that is worrying that it made such a choice. And yes, I know that within climate activists, there's a debate about whether or not renewables could ever get to 100% electrification. But my sense is it really doesn't matter if we get to 100% or not. We have to get as close as we possibly can. We need major investments now in solar and wind. And then we'll figure out the debate later on, but let's get the investment in place. Let's get the generating capacity in place.
Thank you.
So just one follow-up comment. I mean, when you think about it, we bought a pipeline, right? We're now the proud owners of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, an investment that's going to cost at least 12.7 billion and counting. Probably it's going to cost closer to 20 billion, right? And so clearly what the government has done is it's opted to invest in the fossil choice, the fossil future. You know, it's not chosen to invest in renewables. And that is shown directly in terms of the absence of any significant investment to counteract or to even match in any degree of significance that up to $20 billion investment in the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Thank you.
Sue, your turn.
Okay, I'd just like to preface something here. Thank you so much, Terry and David. I'm feeling quite frightened, actually, right now. I had no idea it was quite as bad as it is. First of all, I wanted you to answer at some point in this webinar what you're planning to do with your report once it's completed. It seems like the fossil fuel industry has hijacked the process, in my opinion. So my question, buildings generate nearly 40% of annual global GHG emissions. Typically, 70 to 80% of GHG emissions occur before a building product is even used. Embodied carbon is the name for these emissions, which are created during the harvesting, manufacturing, and transportation of building materials. When addressing the Net Zero Building Code, does the plan speak only of operational carbon, that is the energy efficiency of a structure, or is the concept of embodied carbon used? And my second part to that question is, and is there a plan to scale up supply chains of the new carbon sequestering materials, which will lead to zero carbon buildings?
So I guess I'll start. There's a good news and bad news answer to that. I guess the good news is the federal government in the plan has talked about developing a new building code. Two building codes, a general building code and a retrofit building code, which is really important that we have those. It does acknowledge, however, that building codes are provincial government responsibilities. So it can't do it without Ontario or Alberta signing on, which may be a problem. So the good news is there is talk about changing building codes and bringing in new ones. The other good news part about it is at times the government has talked about the building supply chain and trying to get carbon out of the building supply chain. It has talked about, is there a possibility for low carbon cement? Unfortunately, that usually means carbon storage, but low carbon cement. Is there possibilities of using more wood in building construction? So I think that there is some opening for some discussion there. I don't know how far it will get. I haven't seen the building code. I don't know if embedded carbon is in it. I haven't even seen any discussion paper related to it. All I have seen is an announcement that was in the Healthy Environment and the Healthy Economy report. The bad news is that the problem, we already have the problem. New building codes, whether or not they consider embedded carbon or not, are not going to be the answer in the short term. 75% of the buildings that we will have in 2030 are already built today, and they are bad. They are greenhouse gas emitters. And we have a government who put together a program of up to $5,000 to help energy retrofit homes for 1 in 10 houses. Other organizations, even other organizations that are business organizations, were saying that should be 10 times as big. You need $40,000 to get a deep retrofit in a building, not $5,000. We need $27 billion, not $2.7 billion. And I agree, we really need to ramp that up.
One of the things, just Sue, one of the things I would point to is that, I mean, the Ontario government recently released its new forestry strategy, and it wants to increase the annual allowable cut, even though our forests in the managed forest territory are net carbon sources. It wants to expand the annual allowable cut by up to 30%. So, I mean, but the jury's out, though, on how they're going to do that and whether or not that connects in any way, shape, or form to an embodied carbon strategy for being able to lower, the carbon intensity of our built infrastructure. One of the ways in which we'd be able to tell is if we had a law in Ontario as well as federally that required carbon budgets. So every program would have to be subjected to a full carbon cycle analysis. So it would be transparent for everybody. What is going to be done here? How does this program connect to actually meeting our 2030 targets? How is it going to connect to 2050, the net zero? And what is the net effect of this program going to be on greenhouse gas emissions? And if we don't have those kind of tools, we really don't know what's happening. We're operating in the dark. So carbon budgets, I think, have to be really front and center in what we demand from our governments in terms of accountability.
Well, we have lots of questions. I hardly know where to begin. Maybe I'll try and begin at the beginning, and we'll just work our way through them. One of the first ones is the Paris target the same as the IPCC target, which is 50% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. I'm seeing nods in both directions.
It's not.
Terry, why don't you start with that now?
Okay, so the IPCC will say that it's we need to get to 50% reduction by 2030. That arises out of the special report on trying to keep global warming to 1.5 to a maximum of 1.5 degrees C, which is much preferable to the 2 degree standard. So to get there, to have a reasonable chance of getting there and to get to net zero by 2050, we have to make considerable strides in the meantime, and their target is 50% by 2030. We're nowhere near that as a country. We're at 30%. And recently, when the government announced this climate plan, it talked about they think that they're going to be able to land somewhere between 31 or 32 and 40% reduction by 2030. So no, the requirements, the climate first requirements from the IPC, in terms of keeping warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, is not anywhere near what Canada has embraced in terms of its 2030 targets.
If every country in the world met their Paris targets, we would be in a world of between 3 and 3.5 degrees Celsius, not 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Paris targets will mean we're in trouble. We have to have way more ambitious targets than the Paris ones.
Okay. One of the charts way back now, it said, on this chart, there is no mention of water taking and usage. Should that be part of it? In fact, Gloria asks, why not?
Sorry, I think I'm missing what, are we talking about that, the chart on emissions?
I think she was, yes.
Okay.
I could
I'm not
see
sure
if I
how
could.
yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Okay, let's keep going and maybe she can ask it again and clarify.
But let me just talk about, some of the initiatives in the healthy environment are useful. For instance, it does make a commitment to put some money up towards restoring natural ecosystems and protecting wetlands, so that there are clear climate important initiatives like that. The question is we don't know how much, how big, how serious, but so in that sense, I think that there is a water connection there.
Right.
So
Terry?
just one comment on that is that, I mean, there is the concept of embedded water that we ought to think about too. And when the tar sands, for example, are producing a barrel of oil, it is a huge cost in terms of the amount of water that goes into that. So one of the things that I come back to carbon budgets, but I think that whenever we consider what the government is doing, what industry is doing, and where we need to go in order to keep the climate in a place which is going to sustain human civilization, we need to subject everything that's going on to a full analysis of all of the environmental consequences, including what the impact is going to be on our water supplies. And so all I'm saying is that carbon budgets are really, really important. So are water budgets. And so when a company is planning to increase production in the tar sands by orders of magnitude, that's got a cost in terms of the water implications, and that needs to be accounted for in an open and a transparent way.
Good. Okay, we have another question that's just I think a basic question, but perhaps a lot of people are wondering if you can explain how forests are a carbon source.
Yeah, I'll start and Terry will take over. That forests are sequester carbon in a very long, slow process. As a tree grows, it sequesters carbon. It takes a very long time for that to happen. If you plant 2 billion trees today, it takes a long time for them to sequester carbon. You have a forest fire, and all of a sudden, all of that carbon is released. You have an invasion of beetles that kill ash trees, and you have the carbon released. You have forest companies clear cut land and pelletize the wood and burn it as wood pellets to fuel pulp mills. You're releasing carbon. For the last 15 years, even according to the government itself, our forests have been carbon sources rather than sinks. And that's basically how it happens. Terry, do you want to add?
Yeah, there's not much I can add to that. That's the basic understanding. And it's insects, it's the way we manage our forests, it's disease, it's forest fires. All of those things, by the way, are related to climate change. So as the climate warms, we're going to have more wildfires. We're going to have more of the managed forest sections of this country are going to burn. At the same time, interestingly enough, the Ontario government, with respect to the boreal forest here in Ontario, want to increase the annual allowable cut by 30%. There was no carbon accounting that was done when they introduced that program. What is the impact of doing that? In terms of a forest that really can't sustain what we're already taking, yet we're going to try to increase it. Even if part of that report talks about producing carbon sequestering products, there's going to be a certain amount of release of that carbon, and we need to have the numbers before we can actually manage how we're going to bring down our emissions.
Right, and another comment was there any consideration for the important role that urban forestry as an offset to help Canada reach the accord? But I suspect the answer is it's not big enough to make a big difference.
Well, we don't know where the 200 million trees are going to be planted every year, so that there may be some of those that will be urban forests. And I totally welcome planting 2 billion trees, but I think we should be clear that that doesn't get us to the Paris targets.
And similarly, a lot of us here in the county burn wood for fuel and campfires, and of course, are we in those contributions? But then what's the alternative?
Well, sorry, I don't want to get sidetracked. About 4% of Canadian homes still use wood to fuel their homes, and none of that is considered greenhouse gas in the calculations. In fact, if you notice that renewable energy chart I put up earlier, it had biomass. Well, some of that biomass is burning wood, and in some categories, it's considered renewable energy, whereas in other categories, it's emitting greenhouse gases. That's the
So,
contradiction.
so just a quick comment on that. My sense is that how can I put it this way? The carbon intensity of burning wood to heat your home is something which we do need to put under the microscope. I mean, I love wood stoves. I love the smell of it. I love the aesthetics associated with it. You know, I love the fact that I can cut my own wood on my property if I want to, and have for years, up until recently. You know, but the fact of the matter is that unless you're burning sustainably produced wood, which is sustainably managed, okay, so that you're actually replacing and you're recycling on a full carbon accounting basis for the carbon you're taking out and putting into the atmosphere. That's an important consideration, and the numbers that I've seen are not looking good for older technology. They look better for the new high efficiency wood stoves, but still are not carbon neutral. So I think that there's an issue here that we need to address in rural parts of the country and in this province is what are we going to do, with the fact that our heating systems that are affordable by a lot of people who can't really afford to switch to other forms right now. Absolutely. What are we going to do in that transition? And this speaks to what I would think part of the just transition is we can't afford to leave people behind. And we can't afford to bank on just people being able to do this on their own hook. We have to create programs that are designed to help people be the best that they can be in terms of their carbon footprints.
And of course, that links to retrofitting programs. So
well,
right.
Think about the way that the fuel charge is designed. You pay for a liter of gasoline, there's a fuel charge and a carbon surcharge. Now, on the progressive side of that, the government says that all of the money it collects from the fuel charge is going to be remitted back to people. In fact, we're going to start receiving quarterly checks now, very soon, for those amounts. It will vary by province, but we'll all get quarterly checks around the carbon surcharge. The problem is that, so it's progressive on an income distribution side, but on the other side, if some of that was held, it could be usefully applied to retrofit programs. For instance, the government thinks that by giving the money back to us, we're going to use the money for carbon activities to reduce our carbon. Most of us are going to use it to pay rent and buy groceries because that's the reality of what people face. So Terry's point about, a just transition on this simple example, why don't we have a program that just pays for heat pumps? We say, okay, let's first target those homes that are using oil or that are using wood. Let's give them heat pumps. It's going to be billions of dollars, but it's going to be billions of dollars more if we don't. So I think that there are initiatives that we could actually take, and heat pumps is a good one. Every house should be heated with a heat pump.
I think I was not paying attention at some point in the talk when I think you said you weren't going to deal with the small nuclear modular reactors. Can you explain that because it seems to be a solution in some quarters?
We didn't have any time to go into it. In our larger report, we do deal with small reactors. There is now a nuclear strategy in Canada that's called SMR, small modular reactors. Somehow the nuclear industry has found a new way to create nuclear power. And these small nuclear reactors, the idea is that you build them in a factory and you assemble them at site. So supposedly they're going to be more mobile. They can be used in remote situations. We can go to a mine and say to the mine, don't use diesel anymore to run the generators, use a nuclear reactor to do it. And there is an incredible push, not only in Canada, but around the world to promote these small modular reactors. The problem is that all of the problems remain. In fact, when you read the report, they say they could be cost competitive, but they can only be cost competitive with massive public subsidies.
And no full cost accounting. What
right,
about the waste? There's still going to be the waste.
yes, they still say at the end of it all, they say, oh, and the problem is waste, and somehow we need a permanent solution for that. But regardless of not having that, regardless of not knowing the safety of the small modular reactors, regardless of the clear declaration that it's going to need massive public monies to support it, the government has said, this is our future.
Do I I haven't been asking our principal query people down below here if you have anything to add, if something's turned up as you've been listening.
No, we're enjoying the chat. Thank you.
Sue?
I'd just like to say, I thought that the SMRs, they really hadn't fully developed the technology yet, and it's still in the development stages. So why would we be going after something that we don't even know how it works yet?
Which is precisely the request from the industry, that they want the government to fund the developmental phase to get them to market.
There was a question in the chat about addressing nuclear power, but I don't know whether that person wants to ask again. It was Ann Cole.
I don't know if we can find Anne to take her. We have to unmute her. I mean,
no, that's okay. That's okay. I'm sure she'll speak up if she wants to.
Yeah, okay. Next, blue hydrogen requires at least as much energy to produce per kilogram as the energy that it is available from that kilogram of blue hydrogen. Yes, full cost accounting doesn't seem to be very popular.
Yeah, good comment. Fine.
And
yeah, I just find that the whole concept of blue hydrogen, it's an amazing job that the hydrogen lobby has pulled, that it just out of the blue now, we have a country and a government committed to blue hydrogen, to using natural gas to produce blue hydrogen, to find ways to bury all of that carbon in untrue and untried situations. It's going to require like a 6,000% increase in carbon storage in Canada. And they say, oh, it's great. We've got all of these abandoned wells. We've got these salt caverns. We've got all of these geological formations in Alberta. We have this natural environment to hide all the carbon. But we don't know if it's going to be effective or not.
no. A question, are there other climate action groups critiquing the federal plan? And if not, why not?
Well, I think when the thumb screws have been turned down for so long, when they get released a little bit, you kind of feel a lot of relief. And for such a long time, governments have resisted even talking about it being accountable for the carbon emissions. And so when you have something called the Net Zero Accountability Act, it feels like the thumb screws have been turned back a bit. So I don't know why. I mean, there's been a surprising, and I think a very surprising, degree of acceptance on its face value of this of the Liberal climate plan. And I think that it's going to take a while for us to lift up the rug. And Claire asked what we hope for this particular, study that we've done. I think that one of the things that, we would hope from this is that we've lifted the rug a little bit. We may not have got it right in any way, shape, or form. We think that we've got some things pretty much nailed down, but we want to have a discussion and a debate. And that debate needs to be animated inside the climate change movement about understanding where this federal government is taking us, how that fits with the provincial governments. When Kenny jumps on side immediately with respect to the carbon sequestering portions, the carbon storage component of the blue hydrogen strategy, that's got implications clear across the country. You know, what does it mean for the government to fully commit to extending the glide of the fossil era? You know, it's got serious implications. We would like to stimulate a debate about this and see what the climate justice movement makes of that, and then how we can translate what we understand to be the case into concrete political action to move the yardsticks on the issue.
I suddenly realized there are 21 new comments. I've been negligent, or you people have been talking too much.
I don't have a glass of wine in my hand.
It's interesting. One of these comments here, and it's the he plan, and I sort of an ironic kind of
Right.
It sounds, Val Endicott says, it sounds like our plan relies on the fact that Canada is overall a relatively small contributor in absolute terms. Environmental racism is at the heart of our government's approach. Here's a good question. George asks, what has the reaction been to the report by the large climate action groups? Has there been any response?
Well, I think when it first came out, I was actually surprised at how enthusiastic the treatment was, that the Liberals were congratulated. They were congratulated for hanging tough on a carbon price and increasing it. They were congratulated on protecting natural ecosystems. They were congratulated on committing to plant 2 billion trees. I think, a whole number of green organizations saw, it was like a little light at the end of the tunnel for some of them that have been lobbying so hard for this or that. But it's also, to me, spoke about the problem that when you ask for something from the government through all sorts of lobbying, and they give you something that looks like it, you end up congratulating them. You're caught in this lobby, symbiotic relationship. And I think that's what happened to a number of large green organizations. So, but I don't think anyone has really had the opportunity to look at the whole thing. They've taken bits of it. The National Observer newspaper has done really good critiques of bits of the plan. So I think that what we might be contributing is just a way to say, okay, this is the whole thing. This is what it looks like. And I think, as Terry said, we're hoping that becomes a discussion point for a lot of organizations, because we can all kind of learn from this, and we can all think about, okay, what do we do?
If I can just add to that, somebody in the chat mentioned that the federal Liberals are having their biennial policy convention on April the 9th. So perhaps that's the next step for these three organizations to plan to communicate and to give a little bit more voice to this excellent report.
Sue or Katie, do you guys, I see it's almost 9 o'clock, and we do make a point of trying to hold these events to an hour and a half. It's a lot to take in.
Carolyn, is there any way that the chat can be saved and in David's and Terry's spare time, they can answer the questions that they haven't had a chance to answer yet?
Thanks, Claire.
Absolutely, we do save the chat. I'm not sure how we would get back to individuals, but there's probably a way.
They registered, so we should have their email.
That's right. Absolutely, you're quite right.
And
we'll work on that. Sue?
Each person can actually save their own chat down at the bottom where the three dots are. If you click on that, you can save the entire chat box.
Okay.
That's great to know.
That's good. Thank you very much everybody for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them. Thank you to our panel for your attention and your contribution to this evening's event.